When Tolkien wrote the Lord of the Rings books, he intended them to be a mythology for Britain, which he felt had lost a sense of its folklore over the centuries. Unfortunately for him, people no longer associate the United Kingdom with the Lord of the Rings, and instead flock to its upside-down cousin, New Zealand. This is of course because the movies were filmed on location in the country, and honestly the films do a really great job of showcasing the natural beauty of the islands. But it's also true that New Zealand has a natural Middle-earth-esque vibe to it. So let's take an unnecessarily in-depth look into how New Zealand compares to the Lord of the Rings. First of all, we can say that New Zealand has the perfect landscape to match Tolkien's world. It has no shortage of misty mountains and caverns old, although thankfully it lacks a plethora of dungeons deep. Anyways, much of New Zealand also has a pastoral vibe, which is very reminiscent of the Shire. In fact, it's so reminiscent of it that they built the set for the Shire in the movies right smack dab in the middle of a northern New Zealand farm. You can actually still visit the set of the Shire, which is kept in immaculate condition despite having been exposed to the elements for over a decade. It is technically the set from the less well-received Hobbit movies and not the Lord of the Rings, but you don't notice that when you're walking around the place. The real flowers and plants that they keep as part of the set are truly a treat to behold and add so much beauty and color to the location. Apparently, you'll also soon be able to go inside some of the Hobbit dens, though it wasn't like that when I visited. It's interesting that because of the way they shot the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit movies, that a lot of the buildings are at strange scales. They had to use a variety of cinematic techniques to make the human characters and Hobbit characters appear different sizes. And some of that oddness comes out in the set design, with buildings in the same area all being different sizes, from about a third of the height they should be all the way up to full scale. For Lord of the Rings fans visiting New Zealand, this is the place to go. But it's probably the one you already know about, so let's dive deeper. There are of course many places in New Zealand where Lord of the Rings was filmed. So there are plenty of places to visit, including the locations of Isengard, Rohan, the Misty Mountains, and even Mount Doom of Mordor. Some of these places are well out of the way and might require additional planning and expense to get to, as New Zealand is mostly a very rural country. This can include both requiring an off-road vehicle or even booking a helicopter tour for some of the more remote places. There's a famous story where the actor Sean Bean felt unsafe taking a helicopter up to the filming location on a mountaintop and instead completed a grueling climb up the icy peak in full costume. I guess that means that some locations are reachable on foot, even if it might not be recommended. Mount Doom, luckily, is easy to spot from the highway on a clear day, but it was raining the day I went through the region. Fittingly, it is also a volcano, and New Zealand is stuffed full of volcanic regions for all of you Mordor enjoyers out there. Speaking of the rain that stopped me from seeing Mount Doom, all the bits in the books and the movies where the characters get completely soaked through by inclement weather are the most realistic parts. New Zealand is famous for its rain, and when you visit, make sure that you bring all of your rain gear. Some of the easiest filming locations to get to are in and around Wellington. If you hike up Mount Victoria, which overlooks much of the city, you can find several such spots, including the location where Frodo and his companions first encounter and hide from the Ringwraith. Also in Wellington is Weta Workshop, where you can see some of the mini props used in the films, although you aren't allowed to take photos inside, which is kind of disappointing. Another city with a lot of filming locations nearby is Queenstown, where you can find the setting for both Isengard and the Warg attack scene. Just promise me if you visit that you won't take a tumble off the cliff. Outside of the places where Lord of the Rings was filmed or props are on display, there were also a few interesting coincidences that I noticed that bring Lord of the Rings and New Zealand closer together. Famously, or infamously, in Lord of the Rings, meat is back on the menu, boys, and oh boy, do the people of New Zealand love meat. From sausage rolls to meat pies to this oops all meat dish that I saw in the menus at Denny's New Zealand, this country is a carnivore's paradise. Now, some characters in Lord of the Rings are known to enjoy an alcoholic beverage or two. However, as a gamer, the only sinful beverage I imbibe is Mountain Dew Gamer Fuel, so I cannot speak to the quality of the various Lord of the Rings themed alcoholic beverages at Hobbiton, but they are available, while many might be surprised by this. I've also noticed that there are some surprising similarities between the animals of the Lord of the Rings and those of New Zealand. Among some of Lord of the Rings' most iconic creatures are the giant eagles, which often come to the rescue of the story's heroes when they are in dire circumstances. Many, of course, complain that the eagles in Lord of the Rings are a bit overpowered, so they will be pleased to know that New Zealand recently rolled out a balance update to its giant eagles, completely removing them from this plane of existence. Yes, up until a few hundred years ago, New Zealand was home to the world's largest eagle, the Haast's eagle. This eagle was part of a cornucopia of massive birds that New Zealand acquired due to its isolation and lack of terrestrial mammals. Of course, rescuing hobbits wasn't really on its agenda, although it probably would have invited them around for a very special second breakfast. Now, these eagles went extinct essentially as soon as humans arrived on the shores of New Zealand, as part of a massive ecological collapse that saw the eradication of all of New Zealand's truly giant birds. Now the only way to complete the Lord of the Rings experience is to go to a museum and stare at their bones. On a less exciting note, there's also a moment, I believe in the Fellowship of the Ring, where the characters note black swans flying overhead. New Zealand also has these birds, and I think they're pretty cool. Another type of creature both found in the Lord of the Rings and New Zealand are lake monsters. While the Lord of the Rings ones are admittedly much more monstrous, the New Zealand eel, which can grow to nearly the size of a fully grown man, does have a kill count of its own. These massive migratory eels, found in many of New Zealand's freshwater bodies, have been implicated in the deaths of divers and children. I actually did see these chaps once while I was walking along a lakeside, and I can confirm that I'm not sure if I would want to swim in that lake. There are of course some major differences that do go against saying that New Zealand is just like Lord of the Rings. For one, oceans rarely feature within Lord of the Rings and are often only mentioned in passing, but in New Zealand you will rarely be more than a few miles from the shore. Also, the native forests of the country have an almost tropical rainforest vibe to them, which goes against the generally temperate aesthetic of the Lord of the Rings locations. Still, for Lord of the Rings fans, there is hardly a better country to visit.